Hola and welcome to another episode. Welcome back to Guild Wars 2 Daily. Today we are going to be talking about lore, and in fact not just any old lore episode where I answer questions, but rather a lore spotlight on another one of the races, because I have been enjoying the spotlights, I've got to say I have been, and I saw a couple of comments lately of people asking for a spotlight on the Tengu. The Tengu are my favourite lesser race that exist within Guild Wars, and funnily enough they don't actually have a blog post dedicated to them on the ArenaNet blog. It's one of the next blogs I'm guessing that they'll be releasing for us. They are a fantastic one of the lesser races that we knew a lot about from Guild Wars 1, and since the betas we know quite a lot about them in Guild Wars 2 as well. They are probably the best candidate for a new playable race as an expansion comes out for the game, so this could be really interesting if we're all going to be playing Guild Wars 2, and in a couple of years we could all be eventually planning to play one of these guys. So yeah, I'm going to do a spotlight, tell you pretty much everything we know about them, and also I'll throw up some concept art too, which I don't usually do on Guild Wars 2 Daily, but we can actually have a look at what the Tengu are like. Really, I think that will help a lot of you guys who aren't familiar with them to visualize them. They're quite a unique race in the Guild Wars universe. I've got to say, you don't often see bird people that much, or I don't often see bird people, and you don't often see them get as much coverage and as much lore as they have been given within Guild Wars, which is really, really cool. So that's exactly what the Tengu are, just to introduce to you exactly what they look like. They're bird people. They are an avian race. They used to be able to fly, so it's said. A long, long time ago, they were a race of birds actually capable of real flight, but they seem to have lost that ability a long time ago. Whether it was because of some kind of magical or supernatural means, we don't know, or it could have just been some process of evolution that slowly stopped them being able to fly. But really, that's what they look like, and there are a few distinct differences between them. For example, males and females. The males tend to be actually smaller than the females, but the females have got much plainer feathers and colourings on them, if you will. The Tengu come in many different varieties, and especially with the colour of their feathers, really can be very exotic in some cases, and they are essentially split into what in Guild Wars 1 were known as tribes, okay, so, or clans. You had lots of different clans of Tengu, and with every expansion, or most of the time with the expansions to Guild Wars 1, we learned more and more about the Tengu, except with Nightfall when we didn't learn anything. So I'll just take you through what we knew and when we learnt it, so until we get to Guild Wars 2 and what we now know. So, the Tengu were introduced with Guild Wars 1. At Prophecies, the very base game when it first came out, there were these bird people that existed there. You wouldn't meet them until you were reasonably far into the game. You wouldn't find them until you went to Kryta, which is where you will be if you play as a human character in Guild Wars 2. But to get to Kryta in Guild Wars 1, you didn't start there. You had to travel across the mountains and spend 2 years in the storyline and stuff. It took you quite a while, but when you finally did get there, you met these guys called the Tengu. They are one of the races that lived in Kryta, and to an extent, even while humans were all over Kryta, as they are in today's time in Guild Wars 2, they were still all over the place there. They hadn't been forced out like the Char forced the Grawl out of Ascalon or anything like that. They were generally just around. They didn't get along with humans whatsoever. They thought that the humans were encroaching on their land, as most races tend to in the Guild Wars universe. They were just like that. They didn't like us very much, but these were the first tribe we really met. They were known as the Kuromi. Didn't actually get much lore about the Kuromi. This was something that Guild Wars, when it first came out of Prophecies, really suffered from. There were a lot of things there, but there wasn't much lore initially established. We do know a few things about the Kuromi, though. Not only are they Tengu that lived in Kryta, but they were aggressive to humans and other wildlife. While you were running around, you would often find them fighting other wildlife in the area, like Etins and things like that. And it was said that they would often raid travelling merchants that existed around Kryta, so I suppose this is how they found food or money for themselves. And we also have the name of one of their leaders, someone called Winglord Kuromi, who is their leader back then in Guild Wars 1's time, who was kind of lorded over this whole tribe of Tengu. But outside of that, we don't know anything else, really, about the Kuromi. We know that they continued to exist in Kryta for a very long time, until Guild Wars 2 came about, just before Guild Wars 2's time is actually set in, and I'll talk about what happened specifically there later. But really, that was our first experience of the Tengu, the ones that lived in Kryta. We didn't hear that much about them. Later in the storyline of Prophecies, you would eventually go back to the mountain range you'd crossed early on, but you would be far, far further south. And in the southern Shiver Peaks, when you come here, you find more Tengu, you find another group of them. These Tengu are called the Avakara. Again, because it was prophecies, not that much lore about them, they did look very different to the Crichton Tengu. These guys had far whiter feathers and, in my opinion, a lot more exotic looking armor. It was very golden and it was embroidered and it looked very, very nice. Even less lore about them, though. There's pretty much none whatsoever. You can make observations in the game about how, for example, a lot of them hung around a place called the Mineral Springs and there were a lot there, but really that's just an observation we as players can make. And you could make other observations about, like, for example, how there are no elementalist Avakaras. They just didn't exist in the game except for one boss. So we could make observations like that, but we didn't learn much about this tribe in Guild Wars 1. Those are the two tribes we first saw, the Kuromi and the Avakara. Now, later on in Guild Wars 1's development, something called Factions came out. This introduced a new continent far, 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 far south of anything we'd ever seen in Guild Wars 1. And with it came a lot of new lore. When ArenaNet developed Factions, they looked at a lot of the races that had been introduced in Guild Wars prophecies at the launch and decided that they would expand on some of them. In particular, the main one was the Tengu. So we learned about some more tribes of Tengu that lived in this far, far off land. So we were dealing with different tribes, but we got a really, really in-depth look at the Tengu, and they got a lot of lore at this point. That was when Factions came out, and there's a lot to say here. First of all, I suppose the best order to do this in was when Factions came out, there was a big lore manual that was released with it, as there was with all of the releases for the Guild Wars games. And in that, there was actually a section dedicated to talking about the Tengu, and it said this. It said that the Tengu are a unique species of avian humanoids found in both Tyria, where we'd already been, and Cantha, which was this new continent at the time. Females are generally larger than the males of the species, though their plumage is plainer, even drab. Tengu lost the ability of flight sometime in the distant past, but can use their almost human hands to wield all manner of weapons, when they want to. Their talons make most weapons superfluous. Tengu hate cooked food, and most live on a diet of fresh, raw meat. So that was a little bit of an introduction you could get from those manuscripts when Factions came out. But when you actually got in game, you found out pretty quickly that there was a lot more to the Tengu than meets the eye. Back in Prophecies, we'd only ever found these two tribes, the Kuromi and the Avakara, who hated us, and you would just fight them, and they were just generic enemies, and it didn't go much past that. However, in Factions, you found that there were some that were actually allied to you. This was a new tribe. These people were called the Angchu. They were allied Tengu, and just by virtue of this, it meant you could speak to a lot of Angchu, and they would talk to you and give you an impression of their culture and how they functioned, which was very, very cool. Now, the Angchu weren't the only tribe to be introduced in Factions. There was another one called the Sinsali. The Sinsali weren't as friendly as the Angchu. The Sinsali were not happy with humans at all. It was the same story here, really. In Cantha, there's a big island called Xingje Island. This is where you start the game as a Factions player, and the Tengu used to live on this island in relative peace. They did actually make mortal enemies with another race, the Yetis. There were Yetis that lived there, and they used to fight each other all the time, and they were still mortal enemies by the time we met them in Guild Wars 1. But aside from that, the Tengu lived in relative peace. Then it's the same story. The humans came to Xingje Island and began to expand and encroach on these Tengu's territory, and really it triggered a war between two very intelligent species, the humans and the Tengu. The Tengu are very smart, even philosophical. They are very, very intelligent, and I would say even more, you can look at the centaurs as well, and how it's kind of the same similar thing here. But I would say the Tengu are far more clued in than the centaurs actually are, which makes this war that eventually broke out between the Tengu and the humans that much worse. This was called the Tengu Wars. It was essentially humanity's campaign to conquest and destroy and put down all the Tengu that were living on Xingje Island. And not just there either, but in a lot of places over Cantha, this is essentially what the humans were doing. The Tengu stood up, they revolted, and it resulted in a lot of bloodshed. The Tengu were a really, really dangerous force. These were the Tengu Wars, and initially it started as just maybe a few skirmishes and small conflicts here and there, and not much came of it, but war pretty much broke out when, at some point, as we've already established here, the Tengu like to eat raw meat. Now, the Tengu actually at one point massacred everyone in an entire village of humans. They just killed them all, and humans reported from that the Sinsali that had massacred everyone in that village actually ate the victims, and that they had been consumed consumed and eaten after being killed. And really, that was one of the big first things that brought the humans and the Tengu really, really close to war. Now, there's actually lore about how a personal ambassador of the Emperor at the time managed to create a very brief peace treaty there, which delayed the war. But it wouldn't last, because very shortly afterwards, the humans that were coming to Xingye started to bring disease, and the disease ended up getting to the Tengu and their hatchlings, so their children, which is quite an interesting thought as well. Don't forget, these are like an avian race, so they do lay eggs essentially to give birth, right? And the hatchlings were getting ill, and the Tengu essentially were forced to kill their own young, which is, as you can tell, quite dark, really. You know, you've got all this stuff about the Tengu eating humans and then also having to kill their own young. And it was really when that happened, when they start having to kill their diseased children because of the humans, the Tengu decided that was enough, and the war broke out. There was some pretty dark lore in the faction stuff, which I really like. I like some of this lore here that you don't see so much has been established in Guild Wars 2, which sucks a little bit. But there you go, that's how the Tengu Wars began. They only came to an end when a man named Togo actually managed to, through diplomacy, form a kind of treaty with the Tengu. Now, in Guild Wars 1, this was an event we heard about, this actual end of the Tengu Wars. You heard about it quite a lot, but it wasn't until far later in the game's development, when ArenaNet released something called the Bonus Mission Pack, that you actually got to see it firsthand. In the Bonus Mission Pack, you could play as Togo himself as he went through to make this treaty happen, and you got to see as the Tengu went there for a discussion with the humans about a potential treaty, and you got to see as the Sinsali, this one tribe, decided that humanity could never be trusted, and the Angju, on the other hand, decided that the humanity could be trusted. It gets a little bit more complicated than that, because the people that were actually setting up this meeting for this supposed treaty, the humans, were actually corrupt, and they were just trying to get the leaders of the Tengu together so they could kill all of them and essentially rout the forces of all of the other Tengu and win the war. So the humans were actually being very backhanded, and the Tengu caught sight of this, and that's why this is actually such a big kind of storyline here. But Master Togo managed to, despite the corruption of the humans that had tried to trick the Tengu, he actually managed to form an alliance with the Angju. So Togo made this treaty happen, right, with the Angju, but not the Sinsali, and that was exactly 1 year before we start playing Guild Wars factions. That was a year before all of that happened, and in fact, for players who had like pre-ordered factions, they could actually log into the game, and on that first day, there was a celebration going on in-game that's never come back. Most celebrations in Guild Wars 1 are yearly things, but this was just one time that this happened, and it was actually a celebration called the Day of the Tengu, which players could get to experience. I never got to experience it because I never pre-ordered the game, but you could actually experience this festival called the Day of the Tengu, and that was in celebration of the fact that Togo had made this treaty happen, and it's lasted for a whole year. So really, that's how we start Guild Wars factions, with humanity and the Angju at peace, while the Sinsali also live on Xingye Island in the mountains mostly, near the Yetis, who are also their mortal enemies, still fighting against humanity. So players starting it really got to experience fighting Tengu, but also they got to experience learning more about the Tengu in the way of the Angju. The Angju and the Sinsali do look quite different from one another. The Angju look very similar to the Kuromi that we saw way back up in Kryta, but the Sinsali look very different from them. So they are two very distinct tribes, and they hated each other. The Angju and the Sinsali hated each other. The Sinsali hated the Angju for having this treaty with humanity, and it was the exact same for the Angju on the other side. They fought each other just as much as they fought the humans, which is quite interesting. The only thing really that the Sinsali and the Angju had in common was this hatred for the Yetis. That was the only thing that they had in common. Otherwise, they hated each other completely. Because owing to the fact that the Sinsali we were just fighting against, we know a lot less about them. We learn a lot less from them because we simply weren't talking to them. We do know some interesting stuff though. For example, there were very specific Sinsali that were called stars. So for example, some of them were called star blades, some were called star sentinels, star lights. They were very specific Sinsali that actually protected something called the Celestials. The Celestials are something very much based in what humans believe in Cantha, these kind of extra pantheon, if you will. They believe in the 6 true gods gods, if you will, but they also believe in these things called the Celestials. Obviously, this episode is not about the Celestials, but funnily enough, the Sensali also seem to have something to do with them, because just the Sensali as well, not the Angchu, the Sensali actually in one mission, you are fighting against them as they try to protect the Celestials while you're completing a ritual on the mainland. I don't want to get into the Celestials though, that's a massive other bit of Canthan lore which we can do another time. But yeah, that's really all we know about the Sensali, really, that they have this weird connection with the Celestials that we don't otherwise know about, that they still hate the Yetis, and they hate humanity just as much. While the Angchu had a treaty with us, they did not. As for the Angchu, because we were at peace with them, we actually got to go and see where they lived. There were two places primarily in the game that you could go to see the Angchu, in places they were actually living in. One of these places was a village called the Airy, which was on Xingje Island, and really that was where the most of the Angchu we saw lived. And another place was actually in the city, Kaineng City, on the mainland, called the Roost, which was a small area of the mainland that was designated for the Angchu to go and live in peace among the humans, which was also a very interesting place, but much smaller than the Airy itself. There actually was a lot more information in the manuscripts about the Tengu, specifically the Angchu. So we had a passage on the Tengu in general, but we also have a passage on the Angchu, which I may as well just read out verbatim because it can explain it far better than I probably can. So, the Angchu Tengu of Cantha have long been cut off from their kinfolk to the north. Though Canthan merchants travel frequently to Tyria, few take along Tengu passengers. The Angchu are one of the two Tengu tribes found in Cantha, and are the more peaceful of the two. The more primitive and warlike Sinsali Tengu will attack any humans and any Angchu Tengu on sight. The Angchu have found ways to live with the humans that nominally control their land, while the Sinsali prefer a nomadic life. The Angchu have learned much more articulate ways to communicate, and for the most part remain at peace with their human neighbours. The Angchu reserve most of their hatred and aggression for the Yeti people of the mountains, their sworn enemies since the days before Cantha even existed as a unified nation. The Canthans tolerate the Angchu Tengu, but few view them as equal with humans. So even though there is this treaty, humans are still pretty much racist to the Angchu, and bear that in mind because that will become relevant later. The largest Angchu settlement is known as Airy in the common language, which supplanted ancient Canthan long ago, even on the southern continent. Both Tengu tribes have many names for the place, but refer it to Airy when speaking to outsiders. Airy is ruled by Merlin Featherstone, a wise, gruff, but generally respected old Tengu who acts as the settlement's mayor, sheriff, judge, and, if necessary, executioner. This guy, Merlin Featherstone, by the way, actually never appears in-game. There are different people we see in charge there in-game. There are, like, buildings and things in the village that you can't actually access in-game, though, and I suppose we could assume that he lived in one of those areas. But yeah, Merlin Featherstone exists in lore, but not actually in the game. And yeah, he can act as an executioner if he needs to. Most Canthans attribute the ongoing peace between Airy and the humans of Cantha to Featherstone's leadership. But even Merlin cannot be held responsible if a foolish human tries to venture into Airy or any other Tengu village during the lean months of winter. During that season, when fresh meat is scarce, the Angchu Tengu can become as hostile and territorial as their Sinsali cousins. So as you can see, there's peace, there is a treaty, and there is peace. There's not war like there once was, but there is still very uneasy, and humanity for the most part don't respect the Angchu at all. And in this way, these warnings that maybe the Angchu might try and eat a human, which is quite a scary thought, and obviously goes back into what they were talking about before with the Sinsali eating people after slaughtering them in a village. Kind of makes you feel like the Tengu, despite being intelligent, are still at the end of the day quite wild, really, I suppose. Although, do bear in mind, this line about maybe the Angchu eating people in the winter seasons is something quite fierce, and you never see any more lore like that at all. They really painted a very different picture in the rest of the game, so I wouldn't hold that too close to your chest, because that's not the way I think most of us come to see the Tengu as. But anyway, yeah, really, that's the Angchu and kind of what we learned from them. There were little quotes, in particular, one thing we learned from the Angchu that they talked about was their belief system. We do not know very much about what the Tengu believe, or at least the Angchu in particular, but we do know they believe in some form of an afterlife known as the sky above the sky. And this sounds very similar to the concept of Dwayna, one of the human gods. We all know that every human god has a real realm that exists in the mists that when humans die they will go to as an afterlife. We do know that Dwayna's got a realm, and it does sound very similar to, like, it could be the sky above the sky. So what the Tengu are calling the sky above the sky could just be Dwayna's realm. We're not 100% sure on that, but that's what a lot of people theorize about, which is quite interesting. Aside from that, their belief system and how they function really is never flat out spelled to us, but they did have a very honourable approach, I suppose you could say, to life. Obviously, Factions was very much an Asian-inspired expansion or campaign for the game, and really the Tengu kind of expressed that as well. They had a very honourable approach to life, and they were really quite reminiscent of samurai. A lot of the things they would say and the way they would talk and react to you was very reminiscent of kind of how samurais would be, I suppose. And really that comes through in Guild Wars 2 as well, I think, with their voice acting. They sound very, very much along the same veins. I think that's continued along. So if you ever want to imagine what a Tengu looks like, I'd say either one, look at it on YouTube. They will say things very reminiscent of that general image of like a wizened old samurai or something like that. You'll see what I mean. I'm probably sounding very ignorant, but if you watch it or see or listen to anything they say in Guild Wars 2 and in Guild Wars 1, it really resonates in that way. Aside from that, their belief system and just how they generally interact with us, didn't learn that much more about the Tengu in general, but the Angchu in particular were trying to live in peace with humanity from the end of the Tengu Wars, which was in the year 1071 after the Exodus, and that didn't last too long. Now, as Guild Wars 1 was developed further, Nightfall came out, which was very much an African-inspired continent, but in that continent, this was the first time no Tengu were added. Tengu simply do not live there. There's nothing extra in the lore to do with the Tengu there, because no Tengu were added in Nightfall. They just simply don't live there. There's no tribes based there. It's completely Tengu free, so we got no extra lore with Nightfall. However, when Eye of the North came out, it enabled players to go to more areas around the original Tyrian continent that was released at the launch of the game, and that meant we were back in regions where Tengu lived. So a new tribe was introduced to us as the players. These were the Quetzal. These are my favourite Tengu of the Tengu tribes, not necessarily because we've got a lot of lore about the Quetzal, but because they have a very exotic look and feel to them, and for example, they are green. Their feathers are green. That's something very dramatic and very different that you haven't seen in any of the other tribes so far, but that's really not that much lore at all. I mean, you can speculate and make observations. They're the Quetzal, of course, which is actually named after a real family of tropical birds that you can find in Central America, and supposedly those real tropical birds are actually named after Quetzalcoatl, who is the like a deity of one of the like Aztec tribes or something. But yeah, that's the Quetzal really. We just saw them. They had specific places they lived. They were hostile to us humans as well, so we didn't learn that much about them, unfortunately. But you could go there. They had notices to trespassers up around their lands in Eye of the North, and if you went through them, they'd attack you, and you would see them fighting other wildlife and stuff like that. They didn't like Asura. You could see that they'd killed a lot of the Asura in the area. Generally, they were just enemies. Not that much lore about them. They had some interesting skills, like they could like copy what you were doing and stuff, which I suppose gives off hints that they're quite intelligent and know what they're doing, and they did live in houses and stuff, but we just didn't really get to talk to them or find out anything more than we're very territorial, don't come into our territory. That's all we had really of the Tengu in Guild Wars 1 until Guild Wars Beyond, which was a set of free content expansions to the first game, which eventually told the story of how Cantha became very xenophobic and kicked out many of the other races that lived there. And of course now we are talking about the Sensali and the Yangchu again. We're back down in Cantha. They're a big part of the storyline here. Now, the Tengu Wars ended in 1071 after the Exodus, and this storyline that was released in Guild Wars Beyond takes place in 1080. So essentially, peace between humanity and the Tengu lasted for about 9 years. The Angchu were at peace, and obviously the Sensali were still fighting, but at 1080 after the Exodus, essentially fights broke out again. A new organisation of humans arose in Cantha known as the Ministry of Purity, and they started targeting the Tengu and claiming they were impure and that they were dangerous and that people should fight against the Tengu, which got the backs up of the Angchu and the Sensali. You, the hero, did explain to the Angchu that not all humans were insane and that it was just the stupid Ministry of Purity and that you did want to uphold the peace. So eventually, when the Ministry of Purity was forced back a little bit, when their leader was assassinated, the peace did essentially continue very, very vaguely. There had been a lot of fighting and a lot of bloodshed between humans and the Tengu, but it wouldn't take many more years for the next emperor, the next human that lived in Cantha, to essentially kick the Tengu completely out of Cantha. They were forced out of their home. They were completely forced away and dominated by the humans that lived there, and the Angchu and the Sensali were forced to flee. That happened in the 250 years between the two games, and we didn't actually see that happen in the course of Guild Wars 1. So now we're talking about what happened between Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2, and where the Tengu are now. As I mentioned, there's a tribe of Tengu that live in Kryta called the Kuromi, and these guys apparently decided at some point that they were sick of the humans as well, pushing them about, and they decided to take some land for themselves. There was a big island in Kryta called Sanctum K, okay, and you could go there in Guild Wars 1. It was this huge island, and humans were living there in Guild Wars 1. There were a lot of white mantle that were there, and there was like a monastery there, and we saw that there was stuff there, but it seems that the Kuromi in particular decided, look, we've had enough, and they all went to this island to try and have their own little bit of space, their own little bit of territory. After Zaitan rose from ore and essentially sent all these tidal waves out and disrupted most of humanity's activities around those southern areas of Kryta and forced them away, the Tengu really flourished at this point. And lots of Tengu tribes, we don't know specifically which ones right now, but we do know those two from south, the Sansali and the Angchu, were a couple of them to join the Kuromi, went up north, and they all went to this island, and they built a massive wall. You may have seen it in some of the beta videos. It's this huge wall that they built, and they completely encircled this island, and now the Tengu have essentially just converged there, and they've essentially removed themselves from the business of all other races of Tyria, and they've been in this, behind this wall for a really long time, and called it their own home. This they've called the Dominion of Winds. We've never seen what's inside it, and it will probably be a while before we do see what's inside it. It's certainly not scheduled to be there at the launch of the game. Now, one interesting thing to note about how they've moved like this and all gone and hidden away in essentially what they're calling their home now, this Dominion of Winds. It's got a very interesting name. I suppose it's just because they are an avian race that they named it that. But one interesting thing is you could speak to a prominent Tengu character that existed in Guild Wars 1 called Talon Silverwing. And at one point he would say this to you. He would say, "My people tell tales of the day when we will be free, when our lands will be revealed by a heavenly star and rise. When that day comes, human, only then will our races live in peace." So they had a legend about how they would all eventually find their own homeland and then live in peace with the other races, and that seems to have somehow happened. Did a star really rise? What was the reason why all of the Tengu came here? We can only theorize at the moment, but I think it would be very interesting if what this guy's hinting at here with this legend that was released in Eye of the North, by the way, this lore was added in Eye of the North, so ArenaNet knew what they were doing with the story at the point when they added this. It would be very interesting to see if that story actually did come true. Did that legend actually happen? What was this star? How did the Tengu decide that they wanted to live here at Sanctum K in the Dominion of Winds? Whatever the reason, they've been hiding in there for many years now, and they've just been completely separate and neutral in all conflicts and all things that are happening with other races. They're now at a point, and now we're getting to lore that we've only learned from really being in the betas and listening and speaking to the Tengu that we can find, what little ones we can. At the moment, they seem to just be observing the world, and they are deciding what races they deem that they can have an alliance with. They are actually looking out. They are very suspicious of other races, as they have the right to be, especially over the humans after what humanity did to them. But they are being very cautious and being very careful before they get involved with anything. But they are judging the other races right now, not in the same way that the Kodan are, but simply in their best interest, so that they want to go out and reintroduce themselves to the world at some point, but they need to know that they can do that, and whatever alliances or any interactions they form with races, they know that's actually a safe move to make. What else we know about that's going on inside there is that now the Tengu don't call themselves the Kuromi, the Avakari, the Quetzal, the Angchu, the Sansali. They don't have their original names, it seems, anymore. Even though the sum of all of those tribes may have actually come, or those clans may have actually come into the Dominion of Winds, now they don't name themselves as such. Instead, they live together. They've put aside all of their differences, so the Sansali and the Angchu now essentially live in peace. Obviously, they will look different from one another, but they still do live in peace. But they have essentially reformed what their tribes and clans are called, and they've simply called themselves North, South, East and West, and the four houses are named after the winds, which is something obviously very important to the Tengu, and they were simply created these new four houses to give the Tengu all something new and in common, and to unify them essentially, so they can keep their unique cultures that came from each of their clans or their tribes, but now they don't have all the stigmas of, oh, you dirty Sansali, I hate you, kind of thing like that. Each house then has its own clans that work underneath it, and one example of a clan that we've heard of is called Clan Talon Rend. So that's nothing we heard about in Guild Wars 1. It might be that some of these clans that exist underneath the houses are still called like the Sinsali, the Yangchu, but we've not heard anything about that. We don't know about their religion come 250 years, whether they still believe in the sky above the sky, but I would certainly like to think that they do, and that might be expanded on in the future. So really, we're looking at the Tengu in Guild Wars 2 as this race that's got a lot of information about them. You'll meet a few of them, you will see their huge wall, and it does look very, very impressive. In Lion's Arch, there is actually a gate there to Lion's Arch, the city that is set up to be where all races combine together in the main storyline of Guild Wars 2. There is a gate there leading into Tengu territory that you can't get past, and you can speak to the guys at the gate and see what they have to say about you and about the movements of the world and what the Tengu think of things. And really, they're set up that there's this huge area in the game that the Tengu will soon come out of, and they will open their gates to us. And at that point, this is why everyone seems to think that in a future expansion, when that opens up, you'll probably be able to play as a Tengu. It's located perfectly in the middle of Tyria as it stands at the moment, so it's really nice in scale of where you'll start as like a Sylvari or an Asura. It's kind of near there. It just all seems too perfect, and it seems like really at some point they'll be opening up that part and we'll get to play as a Tengu. It's certainly one of the most favourite races. I'm quite boring and typical in that regard. It's one of my favourite races, and I can't wait for that expansion to really come out. I don't think there's much else to say about them. I probably talked quite a lot. That's pretty much everything we know about the Tengu. That is the Tengu in a nutshell. So there you go, guys. Oh no, there is one last thing. I'm actually looking on Wiki here. Apparently some Tengu might reside within the Guma jungle at this point, but I've not heard anything about that, or I don't know where in the beta exactly we learned that from. But yeah, eventually the Tengu might join us in our cause to rid the world of the Elder Dragons. Maybe something bad will happen to the Dominion of Winds, you know, and an Elder Dragon will start screwing things up for them, and they'll join the fight. But until then, they are kind of this sealed away race for us, with a huge, thriving community and land behind a massive, impressive looking wall that we won't quite be able to go through, maybe until the first expansion. But there you go, guys. This was a really long Guild Wars 2 daily. I may split this in two, I don't know, maybe. Oh, I never told you guys who the footage in the background was from, by the way. Today it was Noxarius, who's got a video for us about playing the warrior in just general PvE stuff, so thanks very much for that. And yeah, guys, I guess that's about it. I hope you learned something today about the Tengu. I hope you're excited to play them. I certainly am, especially if I get to play a Quetzal. That would be fantastic. And I guess I will see you tomorrow for mechanics. I'll see you next time.